Welcome to the realm of the unknown, where the walls of once bustling asylums now whisper secrets of terror. Behind every door, down every shadowy corridor, lies a tale of tragedy, suffering, and the unexplainable. Tonight, we delve into the haunting true stories of the world's most infamous abandoned mental hospitals, places where the echoes of the past still linger, and the spirits of the lost refuse to rest. Are you ready to confront the darkness? Then let's begin. Story number 1. The Ghost of Beechworth. There's something about Beechworth Lunatic Asylum that gets under your skin. Maybe it's the stories, the whispers of the dead, the 9,000 souls who never made it out. Maybe it's the place itself, a sprawling relic of misery that looms over the surrounding countryside like a dark shadow. Whatever it is, I should have known better than to go there. But when my cousin Zoe invited me to join her on one of the nighttime ghost tours, couldn't say no. She's always been the adventurous one, the kind of person who laughs at danger, while I'm the one clinging to the edge of my seat. I told myself it would be fine, just a few hours of cheap scares and local legends. How bad could it be? As it turns out, it was much worse than I could have imagined. We arrived at Beechworth just as the sun was setting, the golden light casting long shadows across the cracked walls and shattered windows. The guide, a wiry man with a flashlight and a nervous smile, welcomed us with a warning. This place has a way of getting under your skin. If you feel strange or overwhelmed, let me know. Zoe grinned. That's the point, isn't it? The group was small, just 6 of us, and we started in the administration building, where the guide told us about the asylum's history. Opened in 1867, it was meant to be a place of healing, but it quickly became something else. Overcrowding, abuse, and neglect turned it into a nightmare for the patients trapped inside. Many of them died here, their bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the building. And then there was the staff, nurses and doctors who were supposed to help but often made things worse. That's where Matron Sharp comes in, the guide said, his voice dropping. She was one of the senior nurses here, known for being strict, even cruel. After she died in the 1920s, people started seeing her ghost. She's been spotted in the wards, the hallways, even the gardens, always in white, always watching. We moved through the asylum in silence, our footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. I kept close to Zoe, my flashlight sweeping over the graffiti-covered walls and crumbling furniture. It wasn't long before I started to feel it, that creeping sensation of being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing there, just the endless, empty halls stretching into darkness. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger the farther we went. When we reached the women's ward, the guide stopped us. "This is where Matron Sharp was last seen," he said. "People say she walks these halls, checking on patients who aren't here anymore. If you hear footsteps behind you, don't panic. It's probably just her." The group chuckled nervously, but I couldn't bring myself to laugh. My skin prickled, and I felt the urge to turn around, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. We moved through the ward, peering into the small, claustrophobic rooms where patients had once lived. Most were empty, their walls scarred by time, but one still had a rusted bed frame bolted to the floor. As I stepped inside, a wave of cold air washed over me, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the wall. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Zoe. She frowned. "Hear what?" But before I could answer, I felt it, a hand, cold and light, brushing against my arm. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. But there was no one there. The tour continued, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting across the wall, a white shape disappearing around a corner. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. When we reached the main hall, the guide paused again. "This is the heart of the asylum," he said. "If you're going to see anything, it'll be here." The hall was vast and empty, its high ceilings echoing with the faint creaks and groans of the old building. I felt exposed, as though something was watching from the shadows above. Zoe wandered ahead, her flashlight sweeping over the peeling paint and broken windows. And then we heard it. Footsteps. First, they were faint, like someone walking in the distance, but they grew louder, more deliberate, echoing through the hall until it sounded like they were right behind us. I turned, my heart hammering, but the hall was empty. "Who's there?" Zoe called out, her voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and then a voice, a woman's voice, soft and cold, whispering from the darkness. "You shouldn't be here," the guide swore under his breath, his flashlight darting toward the far end of the hall. "Time to go," he said, his voice tight. "Now." We followed him back the way we'd come, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was heavier, colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. As we passed the nurse's quarters, I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her white dress glowing faintly in the dim light. Her face was pale and expressionless, her eyes hollow and empty. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt her gaze lock onto me, heavy and unrelenting. I stopped, frozen in place, and for a moment, I thought she was coming closer, but when I blinked, she was gone. By the time we made it back outside, I was shaking. Zoe tried to laugh it off, but even she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. The guide didn't say much as he locked the doors behind us, his face pale and drawn. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing in the hallway, her empty eyes boring into mine. And then there were the footsteps. I heard them in my dreams, slow and deliberate, coming closer and closer until I woke up gasping for air. I haven't been back to Beechworth since. Zoe and I don't talk about what happened that night, but I know she remembers. Sometimes, when it's quiet, I still hear the footsteps, faint and distant, but unmistakable. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of white out of the corner of my eye. They say Matron Sharp watches over the asylum, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. But I think she's not just watching, she's waiting, and she's not alone. Story number 2. The Whispers of Penhist. There's a certain kind of silence that only exists in abandoned places. It's not peaceful or soothing, it's heavy, oppressive, like the building itself is holding its breath, waiting. That's the first thing I noticed about Penhist Asylum. The silence. It was wrong, unnatural, and it stayed with me long after I left. I never wanted to go there, but my friend Eric was one of those thrill seekers who chased haunted places like trophies. When he suggested we visit Penhist, I laughed him off. "Are you crazy?" I said. "That place is cursed." He grinned. "Exactly. Think of the stories we'll have." It wasn't just a thrill for him. It was an obsession. I should have said no, but Eric had a way of convincing people, and before I knew it, we were driving down a desolate road toward one of the most infamous asylums in the country. The buildings loomed ahead like skeletal remains, their crumbling facades bathed in moonlight. Ivy clung to the walls, and the windows were dark, empty sockets that seemed to watch us as we parked the car. Eric was practically vibrating with excitement, but I felt a cold knot of dread forming in my stomach. "Let's stick together," I said as we approached the main building. Eric smirked. "Don't tell me you're scared." I didn't answer. The truth was, I was terrified. The first thing that hit me when we stepped inside was the smell. Mold, rot, and something else, something metallic, like old blood. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint, broken furniture, and graffiti scrawled across the walls. "Save us. They're still here." The air was damp and cold, far colder than it should have been for late summer. "This is it," Eric whispered, his voice almost reverent. "This is where they kept the kids." Penhist wasn't just an asylum. It was a dumping ground for anyone society didn't want to deal with: children with disabilities, adults with mental illnesses, even those who simply didn't fit in. And the stories of what happened here, abuse, neglect, experiments, were enough to make my skin crawl. We moved through the hallways, our footsteps echoing in the silence. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the walls, or the soft patter of footsteps. But every time I stopped to listen, it was gone. It was in the children's ward that things started to happen. The hallway was lined with small, cramped rooms, each one filled with broken cribs and rusted bed frames. As we walked, I felt it, a tug on the back of my jacket. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there, just Eric, a few steps ahead, peering into one of the rooms. "Did you touch me?" I asked, my voice shaking. He turned, frowning. "What are you talking about?" I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could, we heard it, laughter, high-pitched and childlike. It echoed faintly through the corridor, coming from somewhere ahead. Eric's eyes lit up. "Did you hear that?" "I don't think we should be here," I said, gripping the flashlight tighter, but he was already moving toward the sound. The laughter led us to a larger room at the end of the hall. It might have been a playroom once. There were broken toys scattered across the floor, their bright colors faded with time. The air was colder here, biting against my skin, and I could see my breath fogging in the dim light. "Hello," Eric called out, his voice bouncing off the walls. For a moment, there was only silence, and then, faintly, a whisper, "Save me." I froze. The voice was soft, barely more than a breath, but it was close, too close. "Eric," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to leave." But he didn't listen. He was staring at something in the corner of the room, his flashlight trained on a small, dark figure. First, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved, slowly, turned its head toward us, and I saw them, two pale, hollow eyes staring back. Eric gasped, stumbling backward. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. We ran. Neither of us said a word as we bolted down the hallway, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. But the laughter followed us, growing louder, more distorted, until it sounded less like children and more like something mocking us. When we reached the main hallway, the air seemed to shift. It was thicker now, harder to breathe, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that didn't make sense. I grabbed Eric's arm. "We're leaving. Now." He nodded, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. As we made our way back toward the entrance, we passed by the old infirmary. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, we heard it again. "Save me." I stopped, my heart pounding. Something about the voice was different this time. It wasn't just a whisper, it was pleading, desperate. "Don't," Eric said, grabbing my arm. "It's not real." But I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, just rows of rusted gurneys and broken equipment. But in the corner, there was a figure, a small child, curled up on the floor. Her hair was matted, her clothes tattered, and she was rocking back and forth, whispering the same phrase over and over. "Save me, save me." "Hey," I said softly, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" The child stopped rocking. Slowly, she lifted her head, and I saw her face. Her eyes were empty sockets, black and hollow, and her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide. "You can't save me," she said, her voice overlapping with a dozen others. "No one can." The door slammed shut behind me. I don't remember much after that. When I came to, I was outside, lying on the grass near the parking lot. Eric was shaking me, his face pale and streaked with tears. "What the hell happened?" he kept saying. "What happened in there?" I couldn't answer him. I still can't. I haven't been back to Penhas since. But the memories haunt me. Sometimes, Late at night, I hear the whispers again, soft and pleading, just outside my bedroom door. Save me. If you ever think about visiting Penhist, don't. It's not just a building. It's a wound, festering with the pain and suffering of those who were trapped there. And some of them are still waiting for someone to save them, for someone to take their place. Story number 3. The Whispers of Danvers. I've always been fascinated by abandoned places, the way they seem to hold onto fragments of the past. Old schools, crumbling factories, deserted towns, they all have stories buried in their walls. But none of them prepared me for Danvers State Hospital. When my friend Mark suggested we check it out, I hesitated. Danvers wasn't just another abandoned building. It was infamous, the birthplace of lobotomy, where doctors experimented on patients like lab rats. Thousands of people lived and died there, their suffering echoing long after the hospital shut down in the 1990s. The stories I'd heard were enough to make my skin crawl. Whispers in the hallways, screams from empty rooms, shadows that moved on their own. But Mark was relentless. "It's just a building," he said, grinning as he packed his camera gear. "What's the worst that could happen?" I agreed, against my better judgment, and I've regretted it ever since. We arrived at Danvers just before sunset. The hospital loomed above us like a Gothic cathedral, its red brick facade streaked with grime, its windows shattered and lifeless. Even from the parking lot, I could feel its weight pressing down on me, as though the building itself was watching us. "This place is incredible," Mark said, snapping photos as we made our way toward the entrance. I didn't respond. My chest felt tight, and the closer we got, the harder it was to breathe. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay and something else, something metallic, like rust or blood. We climbed through a broken window and stepped inside. The silence was immediate and oppressive, broken only by the crunch of broken glass under our boots. The hallways stretched out before us, dark and endless, their walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. Mark swept his flashlight across the corridor, illuminating old gurneys, overturned chairs, and rusted medical equipment. "This is amazing," he said, his voice echoing faintly. "Imagine what it must have been like when this place was full." I didn't want to imagine it, but I didn't have to. We started in the main building, exploring the patient rooms and common areas. Most of them were empty, their furniture long gone, but a few still held remnants of the past. A cracked mirror, a tattered mattress, a dusty wheelchair. Mark was in his element, snapping photo after photo, while I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It started with the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind slipping through the broken windows, but as we moved deeper into the building, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't random noise, it was voices, low and soft, just on the edge of hearing, like a conversation happening in the next room. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark paused, frowning. "Hear what?" "The voices," I said, straining to listen. "It sounds like people talking." He shrugged. "Probably your imagination. Places like this mess with your head." Maybe he was right, or maybe not. We reached the surgical wing just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the hospital into darkness. This was where the lobotomies had been performed, where doctors had driven ice picks into the brains of their patients in the name of progress. The air here was colder, the silence heavier, broken only by the faint creak of the building settling. "This is it," Mark said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The heart of the operation." The room was massive, its walls lined with rusted cabinets and broken surgical lights. An operating table sat in the center, its surface stained and pitted with age. I couldn't stop staring at it, imagining the things that had happened there. The screams, the blood, the silence that followed. Mark was busy setting up his camera when I heard it again. The whispers, louder this time, coming from the hallway behind us. "Mark," I said, my voice shaking. "Someone's out there." He looked up, frowning. "Don't be ridiculous. There's no one here." But I wasn't so sure. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the hallway, shining the beam into the darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps on the cracked tile. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing down the corridor. "Is someone there?" No response, but the shuffling continued, growing closer. I turned back to the surgical room, but Mark was gone. His camera and flashlight were still there, sitting on the operating table, but he was nowhere to be seen. "Mark," I called, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" No answer. The whispers started again, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. They weren't just talking, they were pleading, begging, crying out in anguish. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering, as a shadow moved at the edge of my vision. "Mark," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "This isn't funny." The door slammed shut behind me. The whispers turned to screams, echoing off the walls and drowning out my thoughts. I could feel the air grow colder, the pressure building until it felt like the walls were closing in. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw them. They were patients, or what was left of them. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes wide and unseeing. They wore hospital gowns stained with blood, their bodies twisted and broken. They didn't move, but their mouths hung open, the whispers pouring out like smoke. I backed away, my heart pounding, but no matter where I turned, they were there, watching, whispering, waiting. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air as the cold night wind whipped around me. Mark was there too, sitting on the ground, his face pale and his hands trembling. "We have to go," he said, his voice barely audible. I didn't argue. We drove away in silence, leaving the hospital behind us. But the whispers stayed. I hear them sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows are long, soft and insistent, just on the edge of hearing. Help us. If you ever think about visiting Danvers State Hospital, don't. It's not just a building, it's a tomb, filled with the echoes of lives that were taken, twisted, and lost. And if you're not careful, you might not make it out. Story number 4. The cries from Taunton. They say that some places are evil, not because of what they are, but because of what's been done there. Taunton State Hospital in Massachusetts is one of those places. It was built in the 19th century, a sprawling asylum meant to house the mentally ill. But over the decades, it became something much darker. Tales of abuse, neglect, and unspeakable rituals have clung to the place like a shadow. When the hospital closed down, it didn't take the darkness with it. It stayed, waiting. I wish I'd never gone there, but like so many others, I let curiosity lead me into something I couldn't understand. It was the summer of 2015, and I was visiting my cousin Ryan in Massachusetts. He'd always been into urban exploration, dragging me to abandoned factories, old schools, and crumbling theaters whenever I visited. That summer, he had his sights set on Taunton State Hospital. "Come on," he said, grinning as we stood outside the chain-link fence that barely kept the world out. "It's just a bunch of old buildings. What's the worst that could happen?" I wanted to say no. The stories I'd heard about the place, the cries in the basement, the shadows that moved on their own, the rumors of satanic rituals were enough to make my skin crawl. But Ryan was persistent, and I didn't want to look like a coward, so I followed him through a gap in the fence, my heart pounding. The hospital loomed before us, its brick walls streaked with grime and ivy, its windows dark and empty like lifeless eyes. The air felt heavier as we approached, the oppressive weight of the place pressing down on me. We entered through a side door, stepping into a hallway lined with peeling wallpaper and broken tiles. The smell hit me first: mildew, rust, and something faintly metallic, like blood. Ryan had brought a flashlight, and its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating graffiti-covered walls and debris-strewn floors. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. the crunch of glass under our boots, the faint creak of the building settling, the soft rustle of the wind through broken windows. But underneath it all, I thought I heard something else. A faint sound, distant but distinct, crying. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan stopped and listened, his head tilted. "Probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Come on, let's check out the basement." The basement? I didn't want to go there, but Ryan was already heading down a crumbling staircase, and I didn't want to be left alone. The air grew colder as we descended, the darkness thicker, as if the light from Ryan's flashlight couldn't reach as far anymore. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were damp, the paint peeling in long strips, revealing the concrete beneath. Rusted pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water that echoed in the silence. And then there were the doors. Heavy, iron doors lined the hallway, each one bolted shut with locks that looked older than the building itself. Most were covered in rust and graffiti, but one stood out. It was cleaner, almost untouched, as though someone or something had been taking care of it. "What do you think's in there?" Ryan asked, shining his flashlight on the door. "I don't want to find out," I said, taking a step back. But Ryan was already moving closer. As he reached for the handle, the crying started again, louder this time, and closer. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping in a discordant wail that sent chills racing down my spine. Ryan froze, his hand hovering over the handle. "Okay, maybe we shouldn't," he started. But before he could finish, the sound stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the crying. And then the door opened on its own. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A figure standing just inside the doorway. It was tall and thin, his body twisted at odd angles, his face hidden in shadow. I blinked, and it was gone. Ryan took a step back, his face pale. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, something slammed into me from behind. I stumbled forward, catching myself on the wall. I spun around, expecting to see Ryan, but he was still standing by the door, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What's wrong?" he asked, but I couldn't speak. My chest was tight, my breath coming in short gasps. I felt it again, a force, cold and heavy, shoving me toward the open door. "Let's get out of here," I managed to choke out, grabbing Ryan's arm. He didn't argue. We ran back up the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. But the crying followed us. It grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like it was coming from all around us. I thought I heard whispers too, soft and insistent, repeating the same phrase over and over. "They took me. They took me." By the time we reached the exit, I could barely think straight. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely climb through the gap in the fence. Ryan was right behind me, his face pale and his breath ragged. We didn't speak on the drive home. I couldn't stop hearing the cries, couldn't shake the feeling of cold hands on my back, pushing me toward something I couldn't see. For weeks after, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that doorway, felt that presence pressing against me. I started hearing things, faint whispers in the dead of night, soft cries that seemed to come from the walls. And then there were the shadows. I'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye, tall, twisted shapes that disappeared when I turned to look. But I knew they were there, watching, waiting. I haven't spoken to Ryan in years. He doesn't answer my calls, and I don't blame him. Whatever we encountered that night, it left a mark on both of us. If you're ever tempted to visit Danvers State Hospital, don't. Some places are meant to be forgotten. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some cries are meant to be left unanswered. Story number 5. The Dark Hall of Gonjiam. I never intended to visit Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital. I'd heard the stories, how it was one of the most haunted places in the world, how it was abandoned under mysterious circumstances in the 1990s. I knew about the rumors, the whispers of patients dying under strange and horrific circumstances, and the chilling accounts of visitors who claimed they felt an unseen presence following them. It wasn't the kind of place I'd go looking for, but when my friend Jay insisted on exploring it during our trip to South Korea, caved. "It's just an old building," he said, grinning as we stood outside the rusting gates. "What's the worst that could happen?" The worst? I didn't know it then, but I'd soon find out. The hospital loomed ahead of us, its broken windows like dark eyes staring out over the overgrown grounds. The building was massive, its once white walls streaked with grime and moss. Even standing outside, I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and a strange silence hung over everything, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. We climbed through a gap in the chain-link fence and made our way inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Damp, musty, with a faint metallic tang that reminded me of blood. The hallway stretched out before us, littered with debris and graffiti. The walls were cracked and stained, the paint peeling away in long strips. Jay was ahead of me, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "This is incredible," he said, his voice echoing faintly. "It's like a snapshot of the past." I didn't respond. My focus was on the feeling creeping up my spine, a sensation of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the shadows, but there was nothing there. We explored the upper floors first, moving through what must have been patient rooms. Most were empty, their beds and furniture long gone, but a few still had remnants of the past. A rusted bed frame, a torn mattress, even a few scattered medical charts. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional creak of the building settling. "Do you feel that?" I asked Jay as we moved deeper into the building. "Feel what?" he replied, glancing back at me. "Like pressure, like the air is heavier here." He shrugged. "It's just your imagination. Places like this mess with your head." Maybe he was right, or maybe not. It was when we reached the lower levels that things started to change. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, as we descended the crumbling staircase to the basement. This was the part of the hospital that everyone talked about, the place where the worst of the rumors originated. They said patients were brought here for treatment that was anything but therapeutic. They said screams echoed through these halls. Even now, decades after the hospital closed, I didn't want to go down there, but Jay was already moving ahead, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. "This is where it gets interesting." The basement was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were lined with pipes that dripped water onto the cracked tile floor, and the air was thick with a sour, metallic stench. As we moved deeper, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Every step felt heavier, like the building itself was trying to hold us back. And then we heard it, a faint sound, echoing through the hallway. First, I thought it was just the wind, but as we stood there, straining to listen, it grew clearer. It was a scream, high-pitched, desperate, and filled with pain. It echoed off the walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Jay's grin faltered, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in his eyes. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shook my head, my heart pounding. Maybe we should leave. But Jay wasn't ready to give up. He moved toward the sound, his flashlight sweeping across the walls. I didn't want to follow, but I couldn't let him go alone. The hallway led us to a large metal door, its surface rusted and covered in scratches. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but as we approached, creaked slightly, as if inviting us in. Jay hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. "You hear that?" he asked. I nodded. The screams had stopped, replaced by something worse, whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there, just beneath the edge of hearing. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a tone that made my skin crawl. Jay pushed the door open. The room beyond was large and empty, its walls lined with rusted hooks and chains. The floor was stained with something dark, and the air was freezing, so cold I could see my breath fogging in the dim light. In the center of the room stood a single chair, its metal frame bent and twisted, its surface stained with rust or blood. "This is..." Jay trailed off, his voice barely a whisper. Before he could finish, the door slammed shut behind us. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to move, twisting and writhing along the walls, and I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. "Jay," I said, my voice shaking, "we need to get out of here." He didn't respond. He was staring at the chair, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. Slowly, he pointed. There, sitting in the chair, was a figure. It was a man, or what was left of one. His body was thin, almost skeletal, and his face was obscured by the shadows. His head was tilted downward, but as we watched, he began to lift it, slowly, as if it took all his strength. When his eyes met mine, I felt a wave of cold wash over me. They were empty, hollow, but filled with something I can only describe as malice. His lips twisted into a grin, and then he began to laugh. A low, guttural sound that echoed through the room, growing louder and more unhinged with each passing second. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Jay's arm. "Run." We bolted for the door, throwing it open and racing down the hallway. The whispers followed us, growing louder, and I could feel something behind us, something cold and dark, reaching out. By the time we reached the stairs, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop, couldn't. When we finally burst out into the night, I collapsed on the grass, gasping for air. Jay was right behind me, his face pale and his hands trembling. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the car. There was nothing to say. I don't know what we saw in that room, and I don't want to know. I haven't spoken to Jay since that night, but I've heard he doesn't sleep much anymore. Neither do I. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, soft and insistent, just outside my bedroom door. If you ever find yourself near Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital, do yourself a favor, stay away. There are some places that were never meant to be disturbed, and some doors that should never be opened. Story number 6. The Haunting of Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. I'd never heard of Dr. Henry Cotton until the night I stepped into Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. If I had, maybe I wouldn't have gone. Maybe I'd have known better than to follow my friend Tyler on another one of his so-called adventures. But I didn't know. Not about the man. Not about what he did. And definitely not about what still lingers in that place. It was October 2019, a few weeks before Halloween. Tyler had a way of finding the creepiest places to explore, and he'd been obsessed with Trenton for months. "You've got to see this place," he'd said. "It's got everything: creepy hallways, insane stories, and ghosts. Real ones." I didn't believe in ghosts, or, at least, I didn't think I did. But that night, my skepticism was tested in ways I'll never forget. The hospital was massive, a hulking ruin of brick and steel that loomed over the surrounding trees like a predator. We parked at the edge of the property and climbed through a hole in the fence, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we made our way inside. The air changed the moment we crossed the threshold. It was heavier, colder, and carried a faint metallic tang that made my stomach turn. The main hallway stretched out before us, its walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. Tyler grinned, clearly in his element. "Let's check out the surgical wing," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. "That's where the real action is." I didn't want to go. Something about the place felt wrong, like we were trespassing on more than just property. But Tyler was already moving, and I didn't want to be left behind. The surgical wing was at the far end of the hospital, past rows of empty rooms and broken furniture. The deeper we went, the colder it got. until I could see my breath fogging in the air. Tyler's flashlight swept over a door marked Operating Theater, and he stopped, his grin widening. "This is it," he said, pushing the door open. The room was huge, its walls lined with rusted equipment and cracked tiles. A single operating table sat in the center, its surface stained and pitted with age. Chains dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently despite the still air. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stepped inside. "Do you know what happened here?" Tyler asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. "This is where Dr. Cotton did his experiments." I'd heard rumors about Cotton, how he believed mental illness was caused by infections in the body, and how he'd performed unnecessary surgeries to cure his patients. Teeth, tonsils, stomachs, he removed them all, often without consent. Hundreds of people died under his knife, their suffering buried under a veneer of medical progress. "This place is his legacy," Tyler said, gesturing around the room. "People say you can still hear him laughing, like he's proud of what he did." As if on cue, the sound of faint laughter echoed through the room. It was soft, distant, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" Tyler nodded, his grin faltering for the first time. "Probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it filled the room. It wasn't just laughter, it was manic, high-pitched and cruel, like someone mocking us from the shadows. I turned toward the door, ready to bolt, but Tyler grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said, his voice trembling. "Look." First, I didn't see it, but then my eyes adjusted, and I saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a white coat that glowed faintly in the dim light. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes hollow, and his lips were stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. "Dr. Cotton," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't move, but the laughter continued, louder now, echoing off the walls. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I spun around, but there was no one there. When I turned back, the figure was gone. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. Tyler didn't argue. We bolted from the room, our footsteps echoing down the empty hallways. But the laughter followed us, growing fainter as we put distance between ourselves and the surgical wing. When we reached the main hall, I thought we were safe, but then I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from behind us. "Stay." I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Tyler grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said, pulling me toward the exit. "Just keep moving." We made it back to the car, and for a moment, I thought it was over, but as I climbed into the passenger seat, I felt something cold brush against my neck. I turned, and for a split second, I saw him again, standing in the shadows, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. Tyler started the car, and we sped away, the hospital disappearing into the darkness. Neither of us spoke on the drive home. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that pale figure staring back at me. I haven't been back to Trenton since, but the memories linger. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the laughter again, soft and cruel, echoing in the back of my mind. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a tall figure in a white coat, watching, waiting. They say Dr. Cotton's ghost still walks the halls of Trenton, proud of the horrors he inflicted in the name of medicine. But I think it's more than that. I think he's still searching for his next patient. If you ever find yourself near Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, stay away. Some legacies are better left forgotten, and some ghosts should never be disturbed. Story number 7. The Haunting of Waverly Hills. There's something about Waverly Hills Sanatorium that sticks with you. It isn't just the stories, though there are plenty of those ghostly figures, disembodied screams, and the infamous death tunnel, where they slid hundreds of corpses down the hill to avoid alarming other patients. No, it's more than that. It's the feeling you get when you stand in front of it. A looming fortress of decay, as if the building itself is alive, watching, waiting. I didn't want to go there, but my friend Matt wouldn't shut up about it. He'd been talking about Waverly Hills for weeks, ever since he found out they offered after-dark tours. "Come on," he'd said, grinning like a kid daring you to jump off a cliff. "It's just a building. What's the worst that could happen?" I should have listened to my gut and stayed home, but I didn't. The night we went, the air was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes it hard to breathe. We arrived just before 10 p.m., joining a small group of thrill-seekers gathered outside the gates. Our guide, a wiry man with a flashlight and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, welcomed us with a brief history of the sanatorium. He told us about the tuberculosis epidemic, the experimental treatments, the patients who never made it out, and then he told us about her. "Room 502, he said, his voice dropping for effect. "It's the most haunted spot in the building. They say a nurse hung herself there in the 1930s, pregnant, unmarried, shamed by her colleagues. People have seen her, standing in the window, staring out like she's waiting for something, or someone." The group murmured nervously, but Matt just smirked. "Guess we know where we're going first," he said, nudging me. I forced a laugh, but my stomach was already tightening. Inside, the building was worse than I'd imagined. The air was damp and stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. The floors were cracked and uneven, littered with debris. Graffiti covered the walls, though some of the older scrawls looked less like teenage vandalism and more like desperate messages. "Help me, don't look back." The guide led us through the first few floors, pointing out hotspots where people had reported strange phenomena. Cold spots, shadows darting across the halls, footsteps that echoed even when no one was there. Matt was eating it up, snapping photos and joking about how fake it all was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And then we reached the stairs. Room 502 was on the top floor. At the end of a long hallway, the guide stopped us at the bottom of the stairs and gave a warning. "If you feel sick or overwhelmed up there, come back down immediately. People have fainted in that room. Some say they feel like they're being watched, like something's pressing down on them." Matt rolled his eyes and started up the stairs, dragging me with him. The rest of the group hesitated, but a few followed, their footsteps echoing faintly in the stairwell. The hallway was colder than the rest of the building. My breath fogged in the air, and I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms. At the far end, room 502 waited, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Matt went in first, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The room was empty, just peeling paint and cracked tiles. But the air inside felt heavier, thicker, like it was trying to push us out. "See," Matt said, turning to grin at me. "Nothing to it." But then I saw her. She was standing in the corner, her back to us, her head tilted downward. Her white uniform was faded and torn, her hair a tangled mess that obscured her face. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Matt must have noticed the look on my face, because he turned, his flashlight sweeping toward the corner. But by the time the beam hit the spot where she'd been, she was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "See what?" Matt asked, frowning. "There was someone." I stopped, my throat dry. I didn't know how to explain it, but I wasn't imagining things. I could still feel her presence, the oppressive weight of her gaze even though she wasn't there anymore. The air grew colder, and then the door slammed shut. Matt jumped, dropping his flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the floor, casting jagged shadows on the walls. I grabbed the handle, yanking at it, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow, deliberate, coming closer. "Hello," Matt called, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakably female. "Why are you here?" Matt's face went pale. "Let us out," he shouted. pounding on the door. The voice came again, louder this time, filled with a cold, mocking rage. "You don't belong here." The lights flickered, and suddenly she was there, standing in the doorway. Her face was wrong, her eyes hollow, her lips twisted into a snarl. A rope was wrapped tightly around her neck, the skin beneath it bruised and raw. She didn't move, but the air around her seemed to ripple, distorting the space like a heat mirage. Matt screamed, backing into the corner, but I couldn't move. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I felt everything. Her pain, her fear, her anger hit me like a wave, knocking the breath out of me, and I sank to my knees. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." Her expression softened, just for a moment. Then, she turned and disappeared, her figure fading into the shadows. The door creaked open, and the oppressive weight lifted. We stumbled out of the room, half running, half crawling down the stairs. The rest of the group was gone, the guide nowhere in sight. By the time we made it back to the car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. Matt didn't say a word the entire drive home. I haven't been back to Waverly Hills since. Matt and I don't talk about what happened, but I know he saw her too. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see her standing there, staring at me with those empty, hollow eyes. People say ghosts are just echoes, fragments of the past lingering in places steeped in tragedy. But what I saw that night wasn't just an echo. It was something angry, something broken, something that didn't want us there. If you ever visit Waverly Hills, remember this: it's not just a building, it's a graveyard of forgotten souls. And some of them don't rest easy. Stay out of room 502. And whatever you do, don't look too closely into the shadows. You might not like what looks back. Story number 8. The Shadows of Riverview. There's something about Riverview Psychiatric Hospital that feels alive, as if the building itself is watching you. I've been to my share of abandoned places, old schools, factories, even other hospitals, but Riverview is different. The air feels heavier there, like the walls are holding on to something they can't let go. When you're inside, every creak, every shadow, every flicker of light feels like it's reaching for you. I didn't want to go there, but my brother Ian was filming a short horror movie, and Riverview was his chosen location. "It's perfect," he said, his eyes gleaming. "The vibe, the decay, it's exactly what we need." I reluctantly agreed to tag along. I wasn't a fan of haunted places, but Ian needed someone to help carry equipment, and he promised we'd be out before midnight. If I'd known what was waiting for us, I would have run the other way. We arrived just before dusk. The hospital loomed against the backdrop of the Canadian wilderness, its massive brick buildings shadowed by tall, skeletal trees. The windows were dark, their glass shattered in places, and the grounds were overgrown with weeds. As we parked, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, nothing, just silence. "This place is amazing," Ian said as he unloaded his camera gear. I wasn't so sure. The longer I stared at the building, the more uneasy I felt, like something was watching us from one of the upper windows. Inside, the hospital was a maze of narrow hallways and empty rooms. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of mildew and rust. Graffiti covered the walls, though much of it had faded with time. Ian was ecstatic, setting up his camera and tripod in the first hallway we came across. "This is perfect," he said, adjusting the lens. "Let's start here." As he filmed, I wandered a bit, shining my flashlight into the rooms. Most were empty, their floors littered with debris, broken furniture, old papers, a stray shoe. But every so often, I'd see something that didn't sit right. A child's doll lying face down in a corner, a hospital bed tipped over with its straps still intact, a cracked mirror reflecting nothing but darkness. The first time I saw the shadow, I thought it was Ian. I was standing at the end of a hallway, looking into one of the rooms, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A tall, dark figure darted across the hallway behind me, moving faster than any person could. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. "Ian," I called, my voice shaky. He appeared a moment later, stepping out of one of the nearby rooms. "What's up? Were you just in the hallway?" He frowned. "No, I've been here the whole time." I didn't say anything, but my stomach churned. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe my own shadow, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. As the night wore on, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and the silence became oppressive. Ian was focused on his filming, oblivious to the growing tension. I kept catching glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, shadows flitting across the walls, disappearing the moment I turned to look. At one point, I heard footsteps behind me. They were faint, but steady, echoing down the hallway. I stopped and turned, my flashlight sweeping through the darkness. But there was no one there. "Did you hear that?" I asked Ian. He looked up from his camera. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," I said. "They were right behind me." He shrugged. "It's an old building, probably just the pipes or something." But I knew better. Pipes don't sound like footsteps. Things escalated when we reached the second floor. The hallways here were narrower, the rooms smaller, as if the walls were closing in on us. Ian wanted to film in what used to be the patient dormitories, rows of identical rooms with rusted bed frames and barred windows. As he set up his shot, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. It wasn't just unease anymore. It was a weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The shadows felt thicker here, darker, as if they were gathering around us. That's when the lights went out. Ian's flashlight flickered, then died completely, plunging us into total darkness. My own flashlight was still working, but the beam seemed weaker now, barely illuminating the hallway. "Great," Ian muttered. "Battery's dead." As he fumbled with his equipment, I heard it again, the footsteps, but this time, they were louder, heavier, and they were coming toward us. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Ian nodded, his face pale. "Yeah." We both turned toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. At the far end of the hallway, something moved. It was a shadow, darker than the darkness around it, and it was coming closer. "I think we should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ian didn't argue. We grabbed the camera and started back toward the stairs, but the shadows followed us. I could see them moving along the walls, darting ahead of us, cutting off our path. The footsteps grew louder, echoing all around us, as if the building itself was alive. When we reached the stairwell, Ian froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing. At the bottom of the stairs stood a figure. It was tall and thin, his shape distorted, like it wasn't fully there. His head was tilted, as if it was watching us. "Run," I said, grabbing Ian's arm. We bolted down the stairs, past the figure, and into the main hallway. The shadows seemed to close in around us, their shapes twisting and writhing, and I swear I heard whispers, soft and insistent, like voices just out of reach. By the time we reached the exit, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead. We stumbled outside, collapsing onto the grass. The cold night air felt sharp against my skin, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be out of there. We never talked about what happened that night. Ian refused to look at the footage he'd filmed, and he stopped going on his adventures after that. As for me, I can't forget it. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear those footsteps again, echoing faintly behind me, and every now and then, I catch a glimpse of a shadow that doesn't belong. They say Riverview is just an abandoned building, but I know better. It's alive, and it's waiting. If you ever find yourself near its gates, don't go in. Some places are better left alone, and some shadows should never be followed. Story number 9. The Ghosts of Byberry. People go looking for ghosts at Byberry Mental Hospital like it's a thrill ride. They show up with flashlights and cameras. hoping to capture something to share online. For them, it's just another adventure. A night of cheap scares in a place that reeks of decay and forgotten misery. But for me, it's different. I wasn't looking for anything that night. I wasn't trying to prove the existence of the paranormal. I wasn't chasing legends. I just got lost. It was late October, a few days before Halloween, and I was driving back to Philadelphia from a wedding in New Jersey. My GPS stopped working halfway through the trip, and I missed a turn somewhere on the back roads. Before I knew it, I was winding through unfamiliar streets, the streetlights growing scarcer until there were none at all. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it, the hulking, crumbling remains of Byberry Mental Hospital. I knew what it was right away. Everyone in Pennsylvania knows about Byberry. The stories about the abuse, the overcrowding, the screams from inside those walls. They're as infamous as the building itself. I'd never been there, never had any desire to, but as my car rolled to a stop, I couldn't take my eyes off it. The place was enormous, a sprawling campus of decaying buildings connected by overgrown paths. The windows were shattered, the brickwork streaked with grime, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I should have driven away right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I parked the car at the edge of the lot and grabbed my flashlight. I told myself I'd just take a quick look. 10 minutes, tops, just enough to satisfy that nagging voice in the back of my head. The air was colder as I stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Damp, rotting wood mixed with something metallic, like old blood. My flashlight's beam swept across graffiti-covered walls and broken furniture scattered across the floor. The place was a mausoleum of shattered lives, each corner steeped in the weight of what had happened here. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The halls seemed to stretch endlessly, their shadows deep and hungry. Doors hung open on rusted hinges, some leading to empty rooms, others to staircases swallowed by darkness. I kept telling myself I'd turn back at the next corner, but every turn led to another, drawing me deeper into the building. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from somewhere up ahead. First, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls, but as I stopped to listen, it grew clearer. It wasn't random noise, it was a voice, a woman's voice, repeating the same words over and over. "I'm not crazy." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only revealed an empty hallway. My rational mind told me it was just my imagination, a trick of acoustics in the old building. But my gut told me to leave. I ignored it. I followed the sound, moving slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The voice grew louder as I approached an open doorway. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and then stepped inside. The room was empty. No furniture, no graffiti, nothing but peeling wallpaper and a cracked floor. But the voice was still there, louder now, like it was circling me. "I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy." I shined the light around, searching for speakers or some kind of explanation, but there was nothing. The walls were bare, the air was still, and yet, the voice persisted, a desperate whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I backed out of the room, my breathing ragged. As I turned to leave, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I spun around, aiming the flashlight down the hall. A figure was standing there. It was a woman, dressed in a hospital gown that hung loosely on her skeletal frame. Her hair was stringy and unkempt, her skin pale and splotchy, and her eyes, God, her eyes were empty, like two black pits staring through me. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her mouth hung open slightly, as though she was about to scream. "Hello," I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. She tilted her head, her expression unchanging. Then, without a sound, she stepped back into the shadows and vanished. I should have run. I should have turned around and gotten the hell out of there. But instead, I stood frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. Before I could move, Another sound reached my ears. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the floor above me. They weren't distant or faint. They were close, loud enough that I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the walls as I stumbled backward, trying to find my way out. The footsteps didn't stop. They followed me, pacing above me as I moved through the hallways, growing faster, more frantic, until they sounded like someone running. Then, all at once, they stopped, and the screaming began. It came from everywhere, from the walls, the floors, the ceilings, a cacophony of voices, men and women, all crying out in anguish, their screams blending into one terrible, endless wail. My flashlight went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I don't remember how I found the exit. I don't remember running back to my car or starting the engine. The next thing I knew, I was speeding down the road, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something standing in the doorway of the hospital, a figure, watching me as I drove away. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's empty stare, heard the whispers and the screams. A few days later, I looked up Byberry online, hoping to make sense of what I'd experienced. I found photos of the hospital's interior, and one of them stopped me cold. It was the same room I'd stood in, the one where I'd heard the voice. But in the photo, there was something I hadn't noticed that night. Faint scratches on the walls, spelling out the words, "I'm not crazy," over and over again. I don't know who she was or what happened to her. I don't know if she's still there, wandering the halls, trapped in the torment of her final moments. But I do know this: Byberry isn't just haunted. It's alive, a festering wound of pain and despair that refuses to heal. If you ever find yourself near its ruins, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. And don't go inside, because some places don't let you leave. Story number 10. The Children of Eloise. I wasn't looking for ghosts when I visited Eloise Psychiatric Hospital. I wasn't even supposed to be there. My friend Claire was the one who convinced me to go, swearing up and down that she'd heard about this amazing abandoned place from someone at work. She had a way of talking me into things, and before I knew it, we were climbing through a broken window, flashlights in hand, stepping into the crumbling remains of one of Michigan's most infamous institutions. Eloise wasn't just a hospital, it was a city unto itself. A sprawling complex with dozens of buildings, its own power plant, even a cemetery. Thousands of patients lived and died there, many buried in unmarked graves. The stories about the place were enough to keep most people away, but not Claire. She wasn't scared of anything. Me, though, I was scared of everything. I'd heard too many rumors about the experiments, the screams that echoed through the halls, and the children, especially the children. The first thing that hit me when we stepped inside was the smell. It wasn't just mildew and decay, though there was plenty of that. It was something sharper, metallic, like rusted metal or dried blood. The hallway stretched out before us, its walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of debris under our boots. "This is incredible," Claire said, her voice echoing faintly. "Look at this place." I wasn't feeling quite so enthusiastic. The air was heavy, and every shadow seemed deeper than it should have been. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We started in what used to be the main hospital building, wandering through empty patient rooms and decaying common areas. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: broken furniture, shattered windows, old medical equipment gathering dust. But as we moved deeper into the building, the atmosphere began to change. It was colder here, the air sharp against my skin, my breath fogged in the beam of my flashlight, and the silence was no longer empty. I thought I heard something, a faint hum, like a distant melody. I stopped, straining to listen. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Claire tilted her head, frowning. "Hear what?" "It sounds like singing," she laughed. "It's probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. The singing led us to a smaller building near the back of the complex, one that Claire identified as the former children's ward. It was smaller than the main hospital, but no less eerie. Its windows boarded up, its entrance barely visible beneath a tangle of vines. I hesitated at the doorway, my chest tightening. "Come on," Claire said, pushing the door open. "This is what we came for." The air inside was colder, the smell of decay stronger. The walls were covered in faded murals, bright, cheerful scenes of animals and balloons that felt deeply wrong in a place like this. As we moved through the hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, and then we heard it, a soft, high-pitched laugh, echoing faintly from one of the rooms ahead. Claire froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Okay, that was weird. Let's go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We've seen enough." But she was already moving toward the sound, her curiosity outweighing her fear. I had no choice but to follow. The room at the end of the hallway was small, with peeling wallpaper and a single rusted bed frame. As we stepped inside, I noticed a child's toy lying on the floor, a wooden train, its paint chipped and faded. Claire crouched to pick it up, but before she could touch it, we heard the laugh again. This time, it was louder, closer, as if the child was standing right behind us. We both spun around, but the hallway was empty. "Maybe we should leave," Claire said, her voice shaking. I nodded, but before we could move, I saw him. He was standing in the doorway, a small boy no older than 6, wearing old-fashioned clothes that looked decades out of place. His hair was blonde and messy, his face pale and smudged with dirt. He was smiling, a wide, innocent grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Hi," Claire said nervously, taking a step toward him. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" The boy didn't answer. He just stood there, watching us, his smile never faltering. And then, as Claire reached out her hand, he vanished. We ran. We bolted down the hallway, our footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. But no matter how far we ran, the laughter followed us. It was everywhere, bouncing off the walls, growing louder and more distorted until it sounded more like screaming. When we finally made it outside, the air felt lighter, but the fear didn't fade. Claire and I didn't speak as we walked back to the car, both of us too shaken to process what had just happened. But as we reached the parking lot, I heard it again, the laugh, faint and distant, but unmistakable. I don't know what we saw that night, and I don't want to know. I've tried to forget, but the memories linger. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the laughter again, soft and insistent, as if it's calling me back. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A small boy, standing just at the edge of my vision, smiling. They say Eloise is haunted, that the spirits of the patients still linger there, unable to move on. But I think it's more than that. I think they're waiting for someone to play with. These chilling tales remind us of the fragile boundary between reality and the supernatural, between the forgotten past and the unsettling present. The stories of haunted asylums are not just about ghosts, but about the lives that were once lived and lost within those walls. If you enjoyed this journey into the macabre, be sure to like, subscribe, and join us for more tales of the unexplained. Until next time, stay curious and stay brave.